In a climate-controlled vault at Yale University sits a small book of about 240 pages, written on calfskin, illustrated with plants that do not exist, star charts that match no sky, and naked women bathing in green rivers that flow through pipes. It is written cover to cover in a flowing, confident script, and in 600 years, not one word of it has ever been read. Not by the best codebreakers of 2 world wars. Not by the machines we built after them. This is the Voynich Manuscript. Carbon dating puts its calfskin in the early 1400s. Its script has never been matched to any known language, alphabet or cipher on Earth. And the man who arguably understood codes better than anyone in the 20th century spent decades on it, in secret, and admitted at the end of his life that he had failed. Tonight, what is actually in this book, what the mathematics says about its writing, why every claimed solution has collapsed, and the 3 possibilities that remain. Physically, the book is unremarkable, and that is the first strange thing about it. It is small, about the size of a modern hardback. It has no title, no author, no date, no colophon. There is no dedication, no marginal note explaining what it is. Whoever made it spent an enormous amount of money on materials. Calfskin for 240 pages was a serious expense in the 15th century, and then declined to write, anywhere, what the book was for. In 2009, researchers at the University of Arizona radiocarbon dated 4 samples of the vellum. The result came back tightly grouped. The animals whose skin became these pages died between roughly 1404 and 1438. Separate analysis of the inks found nothing anachronistic. The iron gall ink and the pigments are consistent with that period. Whatever this book is, it is genuinely 600 years old. That single fact eliminates a great many comfortable explanations. Open it, and the book organizes itself into sections. Scholars have named them by what the pictures appear to show. The largest is the herbal section, page after page dominated by a single large plant, roots and leaves and flowers rendered in careful detail, with paragraphs of text wrapped around them like a medieval pharmacy manual. It looks exactly like the herbals that European physicians actually used. There is only one problem with it. The plants are not real. Botanists have gone through them for over a century, and the overwhelming majority match no known species, living or extinct. Some appear to be composites, the root of one plant, the leaves of another, a flower from nowhere at all. A handful have been tentatively identified, and even those are disputed. Somebody drew 200 careful botanical illustrations of a flora that has never grown anywhere on this planet. Then the book changes. The astronomical section fills with circular diagrams, suns with human faces, moons, rings of stars, and repeating bands of text spiraling around the rims. Some pages fold out, larger than the book itself. There are what appear to be zodiac charts, with recognizable signs, a fish, a bull, a crab. Around them, dozens of small naked figures stand in barrels or hold stars, arranged in rings like a calendar of something. The strangest section of all comes next, and it has no equivalent in any surviving medieval book. Dozens of small nude women stand in interconnected pools and tubs of green liquid, linked by elaborate systems of pipes and channels that look almost anatomical, or almost industrial. Scholars call it the balneological section, from the Latin for bathing. Nobody knows whether it depicts medicine, biology, plumbing, alchemy, or something the person who drew it could see and we cannot. There is a cosmological section of vast circular maps, a pharmaceutical section of labeled jars and plant parts, and finally a recipe section, dense pages of short paragraphs, each marked with a star in the margin, like a list of instructions. 600 years of readers have looked at those stars and felt the same thing. This is a book that wants to tell you how to do something. It simply refuses to say what. There is one more detail in the zodiac pages that matters enormously, and it is the only crack of daylight in the entire book. Beside some of the astrological diagrams, someone has written the names of months, and those names are not in the mystery script. They are in ordinary letters, in a recognizable European hand, in what appears to be a dialect of medieval French or Occitan. They were probably added later by an owner who was trying, as we are, to work out what he was looking at. And the very last page of the book carries a few lines in a similar ordinary alphabet, a jumble that has been transcribed for centuries as something like Mishitnanoladabas, mixed with recognizable Latin fragments. It reads like someone trying out sounds, or like a charm, or like a person testing a pen. It is, in a book of 250,000 unreadable characters, the closest thing we have to a human voice, and it says nothing we can use. The book is also, physically, a puzzle in itself. Its pages were bound out of order at some point in its history, sections interleave in ways that make no sense for a book meant to be read straight through. Whole leaves are missing, the original may have been closer to 270 pages. Somebody, at some time, took this book apart and put it back together wrong, and we have been reading it in that order ever since. Which brings us to the writing, and this is where the mystery stops being charming and starts being genuinely hard. The script uses somewhere between 20 and 30 distinct characters, depending on how you count. It runs left to right. It has spaces, so it has word-like units. Some characters appear only at the start of words, others only at the end, exactly the kind of positional rule real writing systems have. It was written fluently. That matters more than it sounds. The strokes are confident and fast, with no hesitation marks, and, across 240 pages, almost no corrections. Whoever wrote this was not inventing it as they went, letter by letter. They were writing in something they already knew how to write, at speed, the way you write in your own language. And when linguists ran the text through statistical analysis, it behaved like language. Word frequencies follow Zipf's law, the same mathematical curve that English, Latin, Chinese and every other natural language obeys. Words cluster by section, the herbal pages use vocabulary the astronomical pages do not. Certain words appear beside certain illustrations. In 2013, a study found long-range structure in the text consistent with real semantic content, not random noise. But then the same analysis finds things no language does. The text has unusually low entropy, meaning it is far more repetitive and predictable than real writing. Words repeat next to themselves in ways no natural language tolerates. One line famously reads, in transcription, like the same word 3 times in a row, then a variant, then the same word twice more. There are almost no words longer than about 10 characters, and almost no one-letter words. It looks like a language, and it violates language, at the same time. Now, where did it come from? The provenance is a chain of owners that runs backwards into fog. The name comes from Wilfred Voynich, a Polish revolutionary turned rare book dealer in London, who in 1912 bought a trunk of old manuscripts from a Jesuit college at the Villa Mondragone near Rome. Among them was a book he could not read, and he spent the rest of his life trying to sell the mystery of it. Voynich himself is worth a moment, because he is almost a character from fiction. Born in what is now Lithuania, he joined the Polish resistance against the Russian Empire, was arrested, and was sentenced to exile in Siberia. He escaped, across Russia, through Mongolia and China by some accounts, and arrived in London penniless, where he reinvented himself as a dealer in rare books and became one of the most respected in Europe. The man who found the world's most unreadable manuscript had already lived a life nobody would believe. Tucked inside the manuscript was a letter, dated 1665, from a Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, the most famous polymath in Europe, a man who believed he had deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. Marci was sending the book to Kircher in the hope that he could crack it. He couldn't. Kircher's failure is the first documented decipherment attempt in the book's history, and it set the pattern for every attempt since. Marcy's letter also carries the story that has haunted the case ever since, that Emperor Rudolph II of Bohemia, a collector of the strange and the occult, had bought the book for 600 gold ducats, an astonishing sum, and believed it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar. Historians now consider the Bacon attribution almost certainly wrong, the carbon dating alone kills it. But the 600 ducats, if true, tells you something. Somebody at the very top of European society was convinced this book was worth a fortune. Before Rudolph, the trail becomes almost invisible. Under ultraviolet light, researchers found a signature on the first page, erased at some point, but recoverable, Jacobus Horsecki de Tepanek, the emperor's own imperial pharmacist, who died in 1622. Beyond that name, going back to the workshop where the calfskin was cut, there is nothing. 200 years of the book's life are simply missing. Which brings us to the Codebreakers, and this is the part of the story that should make anyone hesitate before announcing they have solved it. In the 20th century, the Voynich Manuscript was studied by William Friedman, the man who founded modern American cryptanalysis, who led the team that broke the Japanese purple cipher before Pearl Harbor, and who is generally regarded as the greatest codebreaker the United States has produced. Friedman worked on it, on and off, for more than 30 years. He assembled two separate study groups of professional cryptologists, people who spent their working lives reading things other people did not want read, and put them on the manuscript in their spare time. Neither group broke it. Not a sentence. Not a word. At the end of his career, Friedman left his conclusion in an anagram, sealed for later publication. Decoded, it read, "The Voynich Manuscript was an early attempt to construct an artificial or universal language of the a priori type." In other words, after 3 decades, the finest codebreaker of his era did not believe it was a cipher at all. He thought somebody had built a language from scratch, and then written a book in it. And Friedman is only the most famous failure. Elizabeth Friedman, his wife and a formidable codebreaker in her own right, the woman who broke the ciphers of Prohibition rumrunners and Nazi spy rings, also studied it and dismissed the confident solutions of her day as wishful thinking. Amateur and professional attempts have continued without pause for a century. Every generation produces someone certain they have it. But the most instructive failure came earlier, and it is a story every person who thinks they have solved this book should be made to read. In 1921, William Romaine Newbold, a respected professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, announced that he had done it. His method, under high magnification, he said, each character in the manuscript was not a letter but a cluster of microscopic shorthand marks, invisible to the naked eye. Decoded, they revealed that Roger Bacon had built a compound microscope and a telescope centuries before anyone else. The world believed him. Newspapers called it one of the great discoveries of the age, scholars praised it, he became famous. He died in 1926 still convinced. And in 1931, a colleague named John Manley published The Demolition. Those microscopic marks were not shorthand at all. They were cracks, the natural crazing of iron gall ink as it dried and aged over 5 centuries. Newbold had spent years decoding the way paint flakes. His method could produce any answer the decoder already believed, and it had. That is the shape of nearly every Voynich solution since, a method flexible enough to find whatever the searcher expects. It is why professional cryptologists treat new claims with such open impatience, and why the burden is so high. A genuine reading has to be reproducible by someone who does not already agree with you, and it has to keep working on pages the claimant never looked at. So let us deal with the solutions, because there have been many, and they follow a pattern so consistent it is almost a law. In 2017, a British researcher announced the book was a women's health manual, its script in abbreviated Latin. It made headlines worldwide. Medieval Latin specialists pointed out within days that the proposed readings did not produce grammatical Latin, and the claim collapsed. In 2018, a team using artificial intelligence announced the underlying language was Hebrew, with the letters scrambled. Specialists in both Hebrew and computational linguistics noted that the method would produce a confident answer for almost any input, and that the resulting sentences were not meaningful Hebrew. In 2019, another researcher published a claim that the language was a lost, Proto-Romance tongue. The university that publicized it later withdrew its press release, and the journal's editors faced open revolt from scholars. The pattern is always the same: a confident announcement, worldwide coverage, and then quiet demolition by specialists, usually within a fortnight. There is a reason for this, and it is mathematical. The manuscript is long enough to test a hypothesis against, but its statistical oddities are strange enough that almost any flexible decoding scheme can be made to produce something that looks like words on one page, and then fails completely on the next. A real solution has to work everywhere. None ever has. So what is left? Theory 1, it is exactly what it appears to be, a real book, in a real language or a real cipher, that we have simply not cracked. The evidence for this is the statistics. Zipf's law. Vocabulary that changes with subject. Words that recur beside particular drawings. Long-range structure in the text that random gibberish does not produce. And the sheer physical investment, 240 pages of expensive calfskin, illustrated with enormous care, written fluently by a practiced hand. If that is right, the reason we cannot read it may be simple and depressing: the underlying language may be one that left no other trace. A dialect, a jargon, a private system used by a small group, maybe a single household or workshop, with no dictionary, no second text, nothing to compare it against. Code breaking needs a foothold. If the manuscript is the only surviving document in its own language, there may be no foothold to find. There is a second piece of evidence for meaning, and it is subtle. Beside many of the drawings sit very short words, isolated from the paragraphs, the visual position and length of labels. Star charts have them beside individual stars. Plant pages have them beside particular roots and leaves. If the text were pure decoration, there is no reason for label-shaped words to appear in exactly the places a real manuscript would put labels. Someone was naming things. Theory 2 is the uncomfortable one: it is a hoax. Meaningless text, generated to look like writing, made to be sold to a wealthy collector, perhaps to Rudolph II himself, for 600 gold ducats. And in 2004, a British academic named Gordon Rugg demonstrated that this is technically possible. Using a Cardan grill, a card with holes cut in it, laid over a table of syllables and moved around, he produced text with many of the manuscript's peculiar statistical properties, including the repetition. It is a serious argument, and it explains the low entropy that no natural language explains. But it has a cost problem that never quite goes away. 240 pages of prepared calfskin, hundreds of hand-painted illustrations, and the labor of writing 250,000 characters in an invented script, fluently, with almost no corrections, is an extraordinary amount of work for a con. And the 2013 finding of long-range semantic structure is not what a grill produces. Both things are true at once, and neither side can finish the other off. Theory 3 sits between the other two, and it is the one that has quietly gained ground. The manuscript may be sincere but semantically empty, the product of glossolalia, or of a constructed language, or of a mnemonic or meditative system, written by someone who genuinely believed they were writing something. Friedman's own conclusion points this way. So does the odd combination of fluent, confident writing with statistics that no natural language matches. There are historical parallels. Mystics have produced long texts in invented scripts. Medieval and early modern Europe had a genuine intellectual project to construct universal languages. And a book of plants that do not exist, star charts that match no sky, and bathing figures in impossible plumbing is exactly what you would expect from someone describing a world they were seeing rather than one they were standing in. Today the manuscript lives at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, catalogued with the almost comically ordinary designation MS 408. And in 2004, Yale did something that changed the case permanently. It put the entire book online, in high resolution, free, for anyone. Every page. Every drawing. Every line of unreadable script. The effect was to turn a locked academic puzzle into a global one. Thousands of people now work on it, linguists, cryptographers, programmers, retired engineers, obsessives on forums who have read more of the transcription than most professors. Machine learning has been thrown at it repeatedly. The full text has been transcribed character by character, multiple times, by rival systems. And it has held. And the modern tools have been thrown at it hard. Neural networks trained on dozens of languages have been asked to identify the source tongue. They return answers, confidently, and different answers depending on how they are set up. Transformer models, the same family that powers today's language systems, have been run over the transcriptions. What they consistently find is what the statisticians found decades ago, structure, but structure that will not resolve into meaning. The machines can see that something is organized in there. They cannot say what it is. Which raises the question that hangs over the whole field, and the honest answer is uncomfortable: what would even count as solving it? A translation of one page would not be enough, that has been claimed dozens of times. It would need a method a stranger could apply, that produced consistent, grammatical, meaningful text across sections the claimant never touched, and that predicted things nobody had noticed before. Nothing in a century has come close to that bar. And there is a real possibility, which serious scholars now discuss openly, that nothing ever will, because there may be no message under it at all. 600 years after somebody stitched these pages together, and a century after Wilfred Voynich carried them out of an Italian villa, the Voynich Manuscript remains the most examined unread book on earth. Not a single sentence has ever been read with agreement. There is no partial translation everyone accepts. There is not even consensus on whether there is anything there to read. In 2016, Yale did something else: it authorized a facsimile. A Spanish publisher spent months reproducing the manuscript down to the exact texture of the vellum, the wormholes, the uneven edges of every page. 898 copies, each one sold before it was finished, at thousands of euros apiece. People who will never read a word of this book paid a fortune to hold an exact replica of it. That is worth sitting with. The Voynich Manuscript has been economically valuable for 600 years without ever once telling anyone what it says. So let us end where it began, in whatever room this book was actually made. Sometime in the early 15th century, in Europe, somebody bought a great deal of expensive calfskin. They ruled the pages. They mixed iron gall ink. And then, for what must have been months, possibly years, they drew plants that grow nowhere, star wheels that map no sky, and women standing in green water, and around every one of them they wrote, quickly, confidently, without correcting themselves, in a script that no other human being, before or since, has ever been recorded using. Then they stopped. They did not sign it. They did not title it. They left no key, no companion volume, no letter explaining what they had done, or if they did, none of it survived. The book passed to an emperor's pharmacist, to an emperor, to a Jesuit, into a trunk in an Italian villa, into a dealer's hands, and finally into a vault at Yale, where it sits tonight under controlled humidity, still saying whatever it says. So here is what the evidence supports. A real 15th century book, made at real expense, written fluently in a script that appears nowhere else in human history, illustrated with a natural world that does not exist. Its text obeys some laws of language and violates others. The finest codebreakers of the 20th century worked on it for decades and got nothing. Every announced solution has failed within weeks. That is the whole of it, and everything past that line is a guess. So, your verdict. Theory 1, a real message, in a language or cipher that left no other trace, still waiting. Theory 2, an elaborate and expensive forgery, sold to a credulous emperor, meaning nothing at all. Or Theory 3, a sincere book, written by someone in a system only they possessed, describing a world only they could see. 1, 2, or 3, tell me in the comments. And subscribe before you go, because every story on this channel ends the same way, where the trail stops, and the questions start. At the last coordinate.